Hey everyone, I'm Shah. I just got a new laptop, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to walk through the setup of my AI development environment from scratch. The reason I'm making this video is that there are a lot of people today who want to start writing code and building AI projects. However, before doing that, there are a few key things that you need to install on your machine. While there are countless ways to do this, here I'm going to share the setup that I use as a data scientist building AI products. So I want to start with a brief overview of the things that I'm going to install. First and foremost, getting Python installed on my machine. Second, getting the GitHub CLI set up. Next, getting JupyterLab set up and showing how I do that. And then finally installing Cursor, which is an IDE. So that's the game plan. So the first thing we want to do is to go to Terminal and make sure that Python is not already installed. So it actually should be. It should be like a default install on Mac, but let's just check it out. So I'm going to do which Python. So this will check where Python is found, and it is not found. So let me try something else. Let me do which Python 3. And so yes, there is Python installed on the machine. We can try to see what version it is. And again, I put Python instead of Python 3. So Python 3 version. And then we see that we get this note and it says, I don't have developer tools set up. So again, this is a fresh laptop. I haven't installed any of my typical development tools on it yet. So let's see. So there's a code here. Let me just try to run this command here. So I haven't set up a laptop in 5 years, so we'll see how this goes. Type in my password. Okay, so that didn't work. So now what I'll do is go to Google. I'm going to take this, paste it into Google. Boom, this looks good. I didn't have Xcode installed. Oh, okay, so maybe that's the problem. I don't even have Xcode installed on my machine. So I do not. So let's go to the App Store and install Xcode. While this is going, of course, this is on Mac and people watching this might be on Windows. While the process I go through here won't be exactly what you do on your machine, hopefully kind of seeing me go through this process and troubleshooting issues will give you an idea of what this might look like on a Windows machine or a Linux machine, like whatever you might be using. The reason I think it's valuable to see how I overcome these challenges and problems that I run into is that setting up these development environments can be notoriously tricky, especially as a beginner. Maybe it's your first time using a terminal or a command line tool, so it might be hard to navigate all this stuff. So hopefully kind of seeing how I navigate these issues will give you some confidence and insight into how you can navigate these issues. Okay, so Xcode is installed. Let's go ahead and open it. Type in my password. Oh, interesting. Predictive code completion. Oh, that's cool. I didn't know Xcode had that. Okay, so let me just start with the basic, and then I can always download the other components later if I want to develop iOS apps or something like that. Okay, what's new in Xcode? And now it's installing the predictive code completion thing that popped up on my other screen. We'll let that install. I'll minimize this and I'll clear. And then let me try this Python 3 version again. I only put one dash. You need to put 2 dashes. Okay, so we've got Python 3.9.6 installed on my machine. While this is the default, I actually want Python 3.12 just because it's a newer version. So I'm going to actually go through the process of installing a new version of Python on my machine. So to do that, instead of going to Google, I'm actually going to go to ChatGPT. I'm just going to ask it, how can I install a new version of Python on my Mac? Okay, so this is suggesting Homebrew, which is how I installed it on my last laptop. So I like that. It's also suggesting PyEnv. This is helpful if you want to have multiple versions of Python. While I haven't used it before, I have heard really good things about it. And then the final way is to just download Python from its like official installer. While this is probably going to be the simplest way to do it, especially if you're not comfortable with like the terminal and command line tools. But actually what I'm going to do is use Homebrew. So I'm going to just go to Google and say install Homebrew, and then there are instructions for that here. And so Homebrew is a package manager, just like how pip is a package manager for Python. Homebrew is a package manager for the terminal. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and then get the terminal, and then I'm going to paste this into the terminal. I'll type in my password. So I guess while that's installing, we can go back to ChatGPT. We can probably skip this step because we're installing it. So this is interesting. We can check out the available versions of Python. So let's go back to the terminal. It's still installing, but once this installs, we can go ahead and run that command and we'll be able to see all the different options we have for Python versions. Okay, let's see. Warning, output is not in your path. Instructions on how to configure your shell for Homebrew can be found in next steps sections below. Okay, so Homebrew is not in the path, which means that I won't be able to run brew and run commands from the command line. So what I should do is add it to the path. And so I'll do that by just copying all this code here and then running that, and then we can try brew h to see if it worked, and it did. So this is just brew help basically, and it's printing out all the basic commands we can use. Now that Homebrew is installed, we can use it to install Python. ChatGPT says to do brew search Python to look at the available installations, so let's do that. Okay, cool. So we got a bunch of different versions. What I want is Python 12. So actually, let me just grab this one. So that looks like what I want. So I'll do brew install, right? Is that right? Yeah, brew install, and then I'll just put the version of Python that I want. Okay, so 3.12.8, so that's good. It's installing a bunch of stuff. And the great thing about Homebrew, other than using it to install Python, you can use it to install other helpful libraries like PyEnv, which if later you want to have multiple versions of Python, you can have that. And basically any helpful command line tool you can install using Homebrew. Looks like Python was installed, so let's check that out. We'll do which Python 3, and it looks like it's in the same place, so let's make sure it did replace it. So we'll do Python 3 version. Oh, so it's still the same version of Python is connected to that. Okay, so since it did not change the version of Python mapped to Python 3, let's ask ChatGPT what we can do about it. I followed the installation instructions using Homebrew to install Python 3.12, but when I run the command Python 3 version, I get 3.9.6. which was the system default. So let's see what it has to say about that. So we can check where it installed Python 3.12. So the default version of Python is here. So user bin Python 3, and then Homebrew put a version here in its own directory. So we see that. Find the path of your new Python binary. So this is interesting. So I'm not entirely sure what this code does, but lucky for me, ChatGPT has an explanation here. This will show a symbolic link pointing to the Python version installed by Homebrew. Okay, that sounds good to me. No such file or directory. Maybe it's under 3.12. Okay, so it did that. So let's try something else. Let's try to run Python 3.12 version. Okay, so we see that it did add this new version of Python, but instead of calling it Python 3, it called it Python 3.12. So I think that's good enough for my needs. I can use Python 3 if I want to do 3.9, but if I want to do Python 3.12, I can just explicitly type that in the terminal. So that's good enough for me. So let's go ahead and gray this out. The next thing is I want to get the GitHub CLI installed on my machine. So for that, I'll go to Google and I'll do install GitHub CLI. It has a nice quick start guide here. The value of using GitHub is, I guess, many upsides to using GitHub, but some of the main things for me is that it allows me to share code with other people. And also anytime I come across like a helpful piece of example code or like a project or something like that I want to experiment with on my machine, with GitHub's command line interface set up, you can just do a git clone and copy the URL there. And it just makes it much easier to push and pull code to GitHub. To do that, let's see, we're going to install the CLI Mac OS. Let's do that. We've got the installation here. So for Mac OS, GH is available via Homebrew, MacPorts, Conda, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so good thing we installed Homebrew because now we can install GitHub quite easily. I guess it's right here. So brew install GH. So now that's going to install. All right, so that was easy. The GitHub command line interface is installed. So now we just got to log in and authenticate. So for that, I'll clear this out and I'll run this GH auth login. Where do you use GitHub GitHub, github.com. What is your preferred protocol for Git operations on this host? I think it is HTTPS. Authenticate GitHub with your GitHub credentials. Yes. How would you like to authenticate GitHub? Let's just log in with the browser. That's easy. Copy first your one-time code. Okay. Hopefully there's no danger in sharing this on YouTube. Okay, so we're going to continue. We'll paste this code. Okay, so we got all this. So authorize GitHub. Use passkey. This is cool. Since the laptop has a fingerprint, you can use these passkeys, which just help you avoid having to remember passwords or doing double authentication, which can be quite annoying. It's just like an easy way to log in. Okay, so seems like we're all set. Let's try Git. Yep, so it looks like GitHub was installed. So let's test it out. Let's go to a folder. So let's go to my downloads folder, and then I'm gonna clone a repo real quick. Let's go to AI Builders Bootcamp 2 because this is a pretty small repo. I'm going to copy the clipboard here, and then this just has one example in it, building a resume optimizer. So I'm gonna clone this repo, git clone, copy this. Someone would like to access downloads folder. Yep, go for it. So we got that installed. Let's get Finder opened. We can see that the repo was cloned. Before we move on, we did install the GitHub CLI and did everything we need there, so we can grade this out. So let's show how to use JupyterLab and get that set up for experimentation. Well, there are a lot of different ways to get these things installed and get JupyterLab set up on your machine. I just like to use Python's standard virtual environments. It's like the built-in way to keep track of virtual environments. And so the way I like to do that is we have this folder. So we're just going to navigate to the repo we just cloned. We'll do ls. I'm going to go to this lightning lesson folder. And then here we see that we have this requirements file. Let's see if I can take a peek at that. Requirements.txt. Okay, cool. So we can see in this requirements file, we have these different Python library names. So we can actually install all of these using pip. And you see that the first one here is JupyterLab. So I just like to install JupyterLab as part of a virtual environment, as opposed to like doing some other way of installing it, like with Anaconda or something like that. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm gonna do Control X to get out of here. I'll clear this out. To make a virtual environment with Python, you just type the version of Python you want to use. So we could do, and then we do -m venv, and then the name of the environment. So I'll call this one lightning lesson env, but you can call it whatever you want. Now what we can do is activate the virtual environment. So we do that using source llenv/bin/activate. And then you can see that this text here was prepended to the command line. This is just saying that this lllenv environment is active. And then we can see all the Python libraries that are installed in it, and we can see that we don't have any packages except for pip, and that's because we haven't installed anything yet. So to do that, we can just do pip/r requirements.txt. It's not pip/r, it's pip install/r requirements.txt. So all that's installing. And I guess while that's going, I'll just call out that if you're on Windows, the way you create the environment is the same. So you put the Python version you're using, you can create the environment like that, but to activate it is slightly different. So on Mac and Linux, it's the same, but on Windows, you use this syntax here. But beyond that, it should be exactly the same. You can just do pip install-r requirements.txt. And then once that all installs, we'll be able to launch JupyterLab. So that's all installed. And we can confirm that by doing pip list. And now we see a bunch of libraries have appeared, and then I'll clear that out. And now I'll type JupyterLab. That automatically launches this interface in the default web browser. I don't want notifications about JupyterLab, so we can open this lightning lesson. So I personally love Jupyter Notebooks for experimentation and just like playing around with things. Also writing code examples, because it's really clear. You know, you can put markdown text and Python code in the same document, and then you can run the Python code and you can display the outputs. It just makes it really easy to like walk through a code example, explain what's happening, better so than you can do with a Python script using just comments, for example. So we can run this code. What's going on? Cannot load library library, no such file. Okay, so maybe I need to make an update to this repo, but let's see if we can figure out what's going on with this issue. Okay, so this might be like a Mac thing. So I think this Wheezy print library, there's some special things you need to do when installing. I guess the trick here is that Wheezy print, you can't just install using pip, so I should have a note of that in the GitHub. But anyway, let's install Wheezy print real quick using brew. So good once again that we installed homebrew because it came up yet again. I guess Wheezy print isn't something like necessary for development. I'm just installing it because I use it in this one example. You can use Wheezy print to convert HTML files into PDFs. I used it here to automatically generate resumes, but generally it's not something that's necessary for AI development. I just used it in this specific use case. Okay, so that has been installed. Let's try to run this notebook again. So I will restart and run everything once again. Okay, so now it ran successfully. This printed out like a long markdown file here. You can just hide it like that. Now it's asking me to import some text. We can just put in whatever, and then it stops. So the reason I like using notebooks is because it's like, okay, we have this prompt variable here, for example. What is that? So let's just check out the type. I would say, oh, it's a string. Okay, cool. Let's print it out and see what that string looks like. And it's like, oh, okay, so it's this prompt to send to ChatGPT, for example. And then if this is like too long, you can click on this white space here and it'll make it like a scrollable output. And then once you have a good idea of what that is, you can close that out and then keep writing your code. Another thing is, let's say there's some object that you don't understand. So let's say this markdown thing here. What is this markdown thing doing? You can go down here and quickly type help and put that markdown thing in there. And then it'll print the documentation for that class. And then once you've got the information you need, you can just X that out and move on. I guess the whole point here is that you can do rapid iteration in Jupyter Notebooks. But of course, you can't really write legit software. You can't really write software programs, applications using notebooks. Notebooks are great for experimentation and like demos and projects. But if you're trying to build something practical, you're gonna want to write a script. While you can easily write scripts like Python scripts here. So there's a new Python script, print hello world, and then we can save this as hello.py, and then we can open up a terminal here and we see our Python script is here. So we can highlight this and do Python 3 hello.py. I didn't save it. Python 3 hello.py, and then we see it runs the program. Downside here is that this is like a basic text editor. It doesn't have handy developer tools like what you might see in a IDE like Visual Studios or Cursor, and it definitely doesn't have AI code completion and these kinds of things. So for that kind of stuff, I've recently started using Cursor and they got me onto the Pro plan, so I'm paying the $20 a month for it, but I think it's definitely worth it because of how much it increases my development. Basically, like a project that may have taken me a month to program before, now using an AI coding assistant, I can code that in maybe a few days or a week or something like that. So let's download this for Mac, and then we can close out JupyterLab. We don't need this anymore, and we can gray this out because we have JupyterLab installed. Finder, Cursor, Mac installer. So let's install Cursor. Okay, so you can have different versions, but I'm just gonna stick with the default VS Code. We're just gonna stick with English. One of the great things about Cursor, as opposed to using ChatGPT or Claude in the web UIs, is that the context is pretty limited that you can feed to the large language model to get helpful responses. But the great thing about Cursor is that because the AI is built into the IDE, this development application itself, it can use the entire code base as context pretty easily. We'll just continue. See, help Cursor better. So let's just stay in privacy mode for now. Maybe we'll switch later to help Cursor. Next, we're gonna log in. So I'll just log in with my Cursor account. You're currently logged in as that. Yes. So now we'll go back and open Cursor, and it looks like it was installed. So let's go ahead and just open that same repo that we installed. Cursor would like to access your downloads folder. Yep, that's fine. Now we are here. Let's see. Do you want to install a recommended Python extension for MS Python? Yes. So let's install that. So I guess that's one good thing about Cursor. It'll recommend all the plugins you should install based on what you're doing. So let's try try to run this notebook again. What we can do is go here, select kernel. It'll prompt us to install the Jupyter extension, which is nice. So we'll do Python environments. Let's use Python 3.12, which is what we used earlier. So we'll click on that. And then, so we got to get this environment set up. Let's try this. This probably will make it easier. So let's open folder and let's just open this lightning lesson where the virtual environment is saved. It says GitHub. No, I don't want to do that. So I'll just X that out. Now let's try to do the same thing. We see the virtual environments here. Let's open up the notebook, select kernel, Python environments. Okay, so this is good. So I guess one trick is you got to make sure the virtual environment is in the parent folder that you're running. If it's in a subfolder, I'm sure there's a way to activate it as well, but it's going to be less straightforward. So we'll go ahead and click on this. Now we see the virtual environments activated, and we'll do run all, and now it is running. So I guess this is one of the reasons I don't like running notebooks in VS Code or in Cursor, is because it's a bit wonky. Like, it's pausing for an input here, but the dialog box is not popping up. So let's just interrupt that and do something else. So that's why I don't like running notebooks in Cursor. Anytime I want to run a notebook, I just use JupyterLab. But what I do use Cursor for is writing code. So let's say my first Python function. We see that I just wrote this comment of my first Python function, and then this gray text appeared, and it was basically suggesting a completion. So if I hit tab, it'll automatically write this code for me. And then let's say I wanted to change the function. What I could do is I could do Command L, open up the chat, and say something like, how can I change this function to, let's say, sum all prime, this might be tricky, I don't know if we can do it, all prime numbers between 1 and 100. Pretty complicated function. I don't even know if I would be able to write it, but it wrote out a function for us. So that's pretty nifty. And it typically gives you an explanation, which I like, because I usually don't understand immediately what a lot of the code does that these AIs write, especially like this. I've never wrote a prime number summer before. It says it added this helper function is prime. It used list comprehension with sum to add up all prime numbers. So I wonder, oh, interesting. So it has like a prime number checker. So that's smart. It basically goes through this range of 1 to 100. It checks if it is prime. If it is, it adds it to this list. And then once it does that for all the numbers, it'll just sum all those numbers. So that's a pretty ingenious way of doing it. And what I like about Cursor is you can just hit this apply function, and then it'll show you the changes that it made. So it's going to delete everything in red and add everything in green. And once it makes sense, you can do Command Y or just click this and then click that for that. And then you can run this in the terminal. So you can click this toggle panel here, and then you can do Python hello.py, and you can run that. And so it has our hello world from here, and then it has this print. The sum of prime numbers between 1 and 100 is 1060. I don't know, can we verify this in some way? Let's ask ChatGPT, what is the sum of all prime numbers between 1 and 100? We'll do that, and then I'll ask, oh, okay, this was a Quora thing, and the human said 1060, ChatGPT said 1060, and our code said 1060. Okay, so it looks like that works. So this whole process was a pretty good sample of how I approach any kind of AI development. I use Python for basically everything. When I get stuck, I will use Google search, I'll use ChatGPT, I use GitHub to share code examples and also download projects so I can hack them and play around with them. For doing these experimentations and these small demo projects, I'll do everything in JupyterLab, and I'll run the notebooks in JupyterLab itself, not through VS Code or Cursor. The project requires something more sophisticated that doesn't really make sense in a notebook. I'll go to Cursor, and then here I'll use Claude to do the code assistance for me, but there are other models, of course, that you can use. Basically, this is the approach I use for everything, and I used it to build this website, y2b.io, which is just a YouTube to blog converter. And this whole website, I built it in 4 days, even though I don't have any web development experience. And that was big thanks to Cursor and Claude. That's one of the reasons why they got me on the $20 a month. Okay, so that's basically it. I hope this video was helpful to you. If you have any questions on my tech stack or my approach to development, feel free to drop it in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for watching.